What's up, everyone? Welcome to episode 30 of Mastercast. And in this episode, we're covering a very touchy subject, which is tracking team performance through metrics. So I spoke to Philip Manning, who is quite experienced in this field and actually gave a talk in early 2021 at the SAGSA gathering about this topic. And in his talk, he spoke about three important components that we should be tracking as team leads. Very insightful, and I hope you enjoy. And remember to like and subscribe to support the channel. I hope you enjoy. But can you just introduce yourself to the listeners and the viewers?
Sure, will do. Thanks, Bobby. So it's been a while. I think we've been trying to make this happen. So you would have thought that I would have thought exactly what my intro should be, but I haven't necessarily done that. Consultant's a good word. So I am currently working for a consultancy that does as a management consultant, and it's a company that works in a number of sectors and industries. But the specific line of business that I'm in is human performance and specifically agility. So I work with a team of Agilists in Cape Town. There's likewise there's a team in Johannesburg, working out of Johannesburg. At the moment, it doesn't really matter where we are. We help with each other's clients, providing Scrum Masters and Agile coaches and consulting services to companies and organizations who are going through Agile Transformation. So I spend the majority of my time doing Agile consultancy. So it's effectively Agile coach work and consulting with leadership in companies who want to do a transformation. And the balance of my time is on training. So there are different components to what we do. There's contracting, where we add people to other people's teams. There's coaching, where we consulting effectively, we're helping them with a transformation. And then there's training, where we do a classroom style engagement. So
okay, cool. Awesome.
That is what I do. And then I have spent some time looking after the team in Cape Town as well. So that takes some time as well.
Yeah.
It's a diverse and full week.
Yeah, I can imagine. And the thing is, something I've really have considered or thought about a lot is the word transformation. So much, it's actually so deep. It's, people, we joke about we do stand up, so we're agile. No, there's this whole thing around transformation of becoming agile. It's not easy, and that word gets thrown around so much, but there's so much more to it.
Absolutely. It's a couple of things there. So the word being thrown around is a problem sometimes. I find that people talk about when we're agile or when we become agile or when we're fully agile, which we know is not a thing. It's a journey. There's always further to go. So that's something that we run into a lot. And then the transformation aspect, it really is that. I don't think that the teams we engage with call it that. We call it that when we talk to them. They just talk about, helping us do Agile or teaching us how to do Agile. The transformation part is actually the culture shift that comes. So even though we're there teaching them this framework, which there are books written about, actually what we're doing to this organization is helping them with a culture shift. And so that's the actual transformation is culture change driven by embracing this particular philosophy and set of processes.
Yeah, a word that I've come to enjoy using is mindset. It's like an agile mindset, because it's a way that you approach things. It's culture, but it's a mindset that you need to have when we talk about certain things to understand what it means. It's like that mindset. So and so the crux of what I wanted to talk to you about is, obviously you did a great talk at the SAGSA gathering, the conference at the beginning of this year. And it definitely resonated with me because it's on the metrics. And I think no matter where I've gone, people are always asking about metrics and trying to uncover what it is. And so, can you just tell me your inspiration for why you came up with the talk and just maybe a high level of what it is, and then we'll dive into the detail.
Sure, absolutely. So the inspiration, it's something that's important to me. So as long as I've been involved with Agile, which is since around about 2009, so coming on 12 years now. Nice. It's been an aspect of that way of work. So it's something that I've always been challenged by, because it's difficult to find a one size fits all, and it's something which I've often seen abused. So not so much with Agile teams specifically, although it does happen there. We can definitely talk about that as well, but maybe more on the side of performance management and the way that people are rated and the way that they get the increases, etc. So that's something that's always made me aware how important it is. This specific conclusion that I arrived at, the thing that I talked about in the chat at SAGSA Scrum Gathering, relates to a challenge at a client who I'm currently still working with, where
Okay.
there was a need to put together an agile maturity metric that pulls together many different things. And my intention was to keep it as simple as possible because we work with a large number of teams that have diverse purposes. Some are IT delivery teams, some are business teams. They may use different processes. They're not all Scrum teams, and so it was a evolved over time from looking at all the things that we could measure and then thinking, knowing what I know about big corporate environments, there's too much clutter, there's too much overhead already. How could we make this relatively simple? How could we boil it down so that we had something that's we can copy and paste as much as possible so that it's reusable, it's easy, which means it's easy to understand, it becomes common. And so I arrived at the approach which I detailed in the talk. And so, as you'll recall, no doubt, the talk talked about all the different things that we might want to measure. And depending on what kind of team it is, it could be, it's a technical team, we could be measuring defects, number of comebacks we get after the deploy. We could be measuring the performance of the application or API or whatever it is that we're impacting. There are many things that we could measure on that side, the technical side. On the people side, we might measure attrition, people leaving. If you wanted to be, I wouldn't recommend this, but you could measure how punctual people are for work, things like that. And they all touch on different aspects, and those things all combine. And so the outcome that what the talk focused on was, and I built it up by doing one at a time. The idea was that really, if you really boil it down, I feel strongly, and I challenge people then, and I challenge people now. If you have a different view, if you can see something that doesn't fit into this model, I'd love to hear about it because then we can, tweak it and change it. The idea was that there are three components that cover everything that's important, and those three components were predictability. So I talked about how, sporadic periods of great performance might be good at that time. We delivered something really quickly. Some application or some feature was supposed to be done in 6 weeks. We did it in 3. That's great. But if that was, so firstly, that's probably not reproducible. So if you do that and then next time you're slow, you're going to frustrate your stakeholders. And when you deliver way ahead of schedule, that doesn't help anybody, because if there's a go-to-market plan, marketing aren't ready, the way that it's going to be promoted, all of that stuff's not ready. So predictability is the most important aspect of delivery.
Yeah, I find myself saying that word so much these days. It's scary. We're trying to get predictability. And I think it was actually from your talk that planted that word in my head. And now I use it more often than I probably should. But it's so true.
It's interesting how you see that, right? Something like that happens and you go, I've actually been thinking about this all along, and it pulls it together. So I enjoy that as well. I think that happened for me as well. I had difficult conversations with people about how do we measure performance and are we getting better, etc. And what I realized was that the primary driver was more, and when can we get it, instead of how confident can we be that your prediction is one that we can trust. And so it is, I mean, you get it, I get it. I think the people we work with often do get it, but it can be counterintuitive to tell someone what's important. What's more important than, it is important that your team is productive, but what's more important that they're super productive and super quick in delivery is that they're predictable. Because if they're slow but predictable, you can work with that as well. You can go, okay, what do I need to do to improve this? Do we need more people? Do we need to outsource some of this? Whatever the case might be. If they're, whatever the case might be, if they're predictable, you can plan around it. You can, it takes emotion out of it because you know when you'll expect it. It's not a disappointment or a surprise.
There's a big word that comes with predictability, and that's expectations. You can manage expectations when your team's more predictable. And so you want to tie up those things and say, okay, cool. So I don't know if we want to touch on it now because there's 2 other components, but this predictability thing is quite important. So what do you say to a team that doesn't have any metrics in place just yet? Or what if they're maybe trying to track the wrong thing? Like what kind of metrics helps predictability?
Yeah, so tracking the wrong thing team by team, I guess you depending on your context, you'd only know that after a while. I mean, there's some that are obvious. So maybe a good rule of thumb there is focusing on value metrics rather than effort metrics. So knowing that you are 5 days into a 10-day sprint, just to make a very simple example, does not mean that you're halfway done. It's when half of the value that you were, problems we were trying to solve, the value we're trying to deliver is done, then you're halfway done. So burn down charts are valuable from that point of view. There are other things we do. So general comment on tracking the wrong thing would be when we track effort metrics rather than value metrics. So for example, when we want to track engagement, sometimes we look at how many stakeholders are coming to reviews. That's not useless if you didn't have any coming before. So now they're actually pitching up, so that hopefully that's because they're interested. But it could also be because a manager in some other department, lit a firecracker under them, and now they're there. That they're there doesn't mean they're engaging and necessarily engaging and consuming the content that you're giving them. So the value metric is the impact that engaging with people brings, and that the quality of conversation. So generally speaking, effort metrics bad, value metrics good. So that's how you know it's good and bad. For teams who are not currently measuring anything, I mentioned this in the talk as well. When we launch a team, when we first do a lift off with them, it's important to put something in place. You have to track, you have to measure something. And even if it's the wrong thing, getting into the habit of collecting metrics and knowing that that goes with the process is really important. If you're doing one of the out-of-the-box processes, whether it's Kanban or it's Scrum or whatever it might be, they come with a large number of common metrics that we know. So whether it's cycle time or lead time, things like that, whether it's story points, velocity, things like that on the other side. Those are a good place to start because they're well understood, and there's lots of many tools out there that will help you, manage them or put them in place or derive information from them. So, in the spirit of keeping it simple, which is kind of where we started with this, I would aim for that as well, to keep it simple, to find something that really makes sense. And also, whatever your context is. So, if it's a team that's doing this new way of work because they have a quality problem, then defects. I mean, that just screams track your defects. If you were having 10 bugs a month logged before, if that's going to go down, then that probably is good. Most importantly is the trend, so it's all relative. So if I mentioned this in the talk as well, if you are logging 300 bugs this week, that sounds bad. But if I told you that same team logged 400 bugs the previous week, suddenly it has a different perspective on it. It's like, oh, it's getting less. Okay, so trends over time are probably more important than absolute numbers for many of the things you might track.
Exactly. That's something that I've been talking a lot about to my team in the last couple of days, is that, why are we tracking story points? Because that's obviously that's the most popular one, tracking the story points. And everyone's like, oh, should I give it a 3 or should I give it a 5? Should I give it a 2? Should I give it a 3? I'm like, why are we emphasizing this so much? Yes. Over time, we will get to a point where we can predict things a bit better. We can actually look at the trends. I think trend analysis is quite important. Thanks for putting that in perspective. Is there a time where a team could be over-analyzing, or maybe using too much data, trying to track too much data?
Definitely. So generally speaking, the effort for the team to collect to generate that data should be minimal. So we primarily exist to deliver a product, to deliver for the organization and employs us as a team. So if that is being significantly impacted by generating metrics, then that's a very obvious red flag. There are roles, depending on what it is, product owners certainly for delivery related things, and people related things maybe a bit more on the Scrum Master side. Those are roles that are there to assist with that process. So the team should not be overly burdened with this. It's a good question. I've not, because of the reluctance of teams sometimes to get into metrics and how it's often neglected. That scenario I've not run into a scenario yet where a team was spending too much time generating too many metrics. I have seen teams that collect a lot of data, but it's normally through a tool. So they'd be using Jira or something like that, and churning out lots of things from that which weren't valuable. There wasn't any effort in doing it because it came as part of the process, the tool that they were using. But there was a lot of data, but it was too much to be useful, or it was used in a way that was useful. So that happens. But in terms of it being a burden, not really. I think it's important to review regularly what it is that you're recording, or that you're using, and how you're measuring it, what you're tracking. I think that's important. But it definitely is case by case, at whatever makes sense for you. You got a good example there of user stories. That's a hot debate. I work with a coach who's very much on the no estimate side of things, and I'm very much
hashtag no estimates
valuable. And we, ironically, I guess, agree that it's the conversation that goes around it that's actually the valuable part. It's not, like you say, spending half an hour arguing it's a 3 or a 5. Exactly. That's not valuable. The valuable part is the conversation that happens as to why I think it's a 5 and you think it's a 3, so that we can understand what the knowledge gap is, and we can do something about that. So it's again, with the things we track, it's that conversation and making sure we understand why it is to the thing that you want to get from your team, that you want to improve, or the thing that you want to eliminate by tracking this particular aspect.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like the predictability conversation can go on for a while, but let's start looking at the second component. Do you want to go with which one you want to talk about next?
Sure.
I think it's was it customer
satisfaction?
satisfaction?
Let's talk about stakeholders. So
okay, stakeholders.
Customer satisfaction. So so there were three components that I was saying that all contribute, and between the three of them, I feel they cover everything that's important. And so if predictability is there, you know that the team is delivering. Will deliver when they say they would, and you can start playing around that. The second thing would be to ensure that the stakeholders, the customer, is happy with what they're getting from the team and the interaction they have with the team. So it's the full picture. And the idea there is that if you wanted to test this, the value of these metrics, if you had a team that was, for example, extremely predictable but extremely slow, you could say you're ticking the box in terms of predictability. They're predictable, they're not doing a lot, but they're doing it every 2 weeks. Then when you go to stakeholder satisfaction, stakeholders will not be happy because they'll be looking at it going, this is too slow for us to be competitive, and if I look at other teams, this is ridiculous compared to what we think we should be getting. And so it would fall down there. So predictability, very important. Green light there, but it in itself is not giving you the full picture. The full picture, the second part of the picture is that the stakeholders are unhappy, and so that's something that's critical to add context to predictability, is stakeholder happiness, stakeholder satisfaction, and that's something that you typically would do by surveying them, because your stakeholders are always people, so you'd want to interact with them and ask them how they feel about the way that they've been served by this team. So it's useful to be consistent in the way you measure it, because then you can compare apples with apples over time. And the example I gave in the talk was a survey that I'd constructed for teams that are currently using it, where there's a grading that they would give to the deliverable that they got. So does it do what they want? Is it as agreed, etc.? Is it usable? And it's important that there's a sliding scale, because something might not be perfect, but it's still usable. It allows us to move forward and make some decisions. And so that, that gets credibility, and it goes all the way down to where it's a useless delivery. That's one component. And the second component is the interaction with the team. Was the team approachable? Was I aware of where things were tracking? So were they using their process to my benefit as a stakeholder? Was I able to be aware of what's going on? Did I know who to escalate things to? Did they come to me when they needed clarification on something? Them or the product owner? And so those two aspects, delivery and interaction with the team, creates a stakeholder satisfaction score.
Yeah.
And I'm intentionally not being too specific, because you can create any one you want, as long as it makes sense in your context and you're consistently applying it sprint on sprint. And so you get a measure of whether that's going up or down over time.
Yeah. So Philip, I'm guessing, or I'm assuming that this is in the context of maybe a bigger company, a more corporate kind of environment. Is this where you've used this tactic, strategy?
That's where that's being applied at the moment. There's no reason that could be an interesting conversation. I don't think there's any reason that couldn't scale to smaller setups as well. A team, you'd probably have a more diverse mix of stakeholders if you were in a smaller company. So rather than
I'm going to give you some feedback right now.
Okay, good. So rather than being like the billing team looking after finance, or the website team looking after marketing, you might have a wide variety of stakeholders, and so that makes it a little bit more interesting. However, at the end of the day, you still want on the whole, on average, and on the whole, you want to know that you're keeping your stakeholders happy. So the principle definitely applies. How you measure it might differ. Okay,
no, exactly.
Did you hear your
yeah. No, what I like about the survey is that the questions are there. They're baked in. And so it's kind of putting a framework to get feedback. So I've generally worked with startups, and I've worked with smaller, amounts of stakeholders, or generally the founder themselves or the client. And no, they'll let you know when they're not happy. And this is the problem, right? There's runway. Yeah. There's only so much that they want. And they're kind of saying, well, you're not predictable, you're slow, and all those things that you've kind of already brought up. Yep. And so, it's that question, that interaction now that becomes, okay, cool. How can we use these tools that you're bringing up now to kind of also assist the people that are on the ground? They need results. They've got users. They need to make an impact in the field. So, they'll generally tell you. They'll voice their concern.
So the that scenario where it's a startup, you're maybe a single team, and the founder is your stakeholder, if not your product owner, is your
In
product
essence,
person, your
they
stakeholder.
play that, yeah.
Yeah, is actually people in that situation have a situation I envy. I feel like they're an advantage because you're that close to your stakeholders. So as corporations get bigger and you're part of a bigger machine and it's a little bit more detached and there are multiple layers of project managers and program managers you might need to work through, which is the way it is, and that has other advantages in that it shields you from some of the noise and it's a little bit more structured. But being right at the coalface and close by is advantageous because you get, like you say, you get that raw feedback immediately. So in that scenario, you probably don't need, in fact, you don't need a survey because he's going to tell you or she's going to tell you immediately where it's at, and that's not a necessarily bad thing. There can be more volatile pressures, I guess, in that situation. So in that scenario, in that environment, like you say, it's limited runway, there's funding, it's maybe a month-to-month scenario. However, it truly does give the opportunity to do what Agile tries to do, which is bring stakeholders and delivery teams close together, so that you're really, there's a symbiotic relationship there that you're delivering for them. So I would say, you mentioned a few things there. It's easy there for unfiltered feedback of you're too slow, you're unpredictable, etc. That's where the process that you're following, and I'm not saying process sake, I'm saying Agile, which is well thought out, processes built on that, really can help and stabilize and to a certain extent protect the team, because you can address statements like that with fact. You can go, yes, you're not happy with what's delivered. You have every right to feel that way. We understand it. But here's what's happened. We got the requirements. The requirements changed halfway through the sprint because the founder can do that. And that's okay, he's allowed to do it, but there's a consequence to it. So here was the commitment. The commitment changed. This is what happened. How we did deliver roughly the same amount of work as we did 2 weeks ago. You're not happy with what it is. We get that, but here's what's happened. Here's how we can mitigate that. Let's try, for argument's sake, I'm spitballing, but we try shorter sprints. It seems like things are fairly dynamic at the moment. Can we commit to deliver this? And if at all possible, not change that and then reset and say, does it make sense? Do you want to continue, rather than having this mid-sprint, leverage, pull rank and change things. So it's what you're describing is real, and I've certainly experienced that. But it's you can use the tools at your disposal, and metrics are definitely one of them, to say this is what happens when we disrupt. This is what actually happened if you take the emotion out of it. So it's the same, just slightly different players involved.
No, there's something that I've I think my internet's gone again. I'm gonna wait. There we go. I think I'm back. All right. Am I back? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, all good.
Cool. So I think one of the biggest things that I really enjoy is as you become more experienced, you kind of realize that, like you keep talking about, how well Scrum has been thought out. There's these basic fundamental principles that one would always reference. So when a client comes to you or a stakeholder comes to you and says, new requirements, XYZ, which happens all the time, you kind of can go look at it and take a step back. Okay, what part of the Scrum process, in terms of metric, whatever it is, does this talk to, and how can we then, manage that situation better, and then go back to, once the dust settles, okay, cool, we've dealt with that situation, the principles that, and now we go back to the drawing board, and how can we better go forward? I've been preaching that quite a lot.
Good. You should keep doing that, and and it creates opportunity to have conversations about whether this is even the right framework for us. So if you're doing Scrum, then we know that Scrum doesn't tolerate interruption well. So if this is going to keep happening, maybe this is not for us. Maybe Kanban or something like that should be what we're rather doing, because your requirements are merging on a daily basis. Doesn't make sense. And if it's complete chaos, then we're not right for that. Let's sit down and just stop everything, talk about what are we doing here, why, and start taking small steps in terms of the right direction. But it's
100%.
Again, the same as with estimation. It's a conversation where the value sits. All of these things are to trigger a conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to poke you just out of interest. So sure. I watched a talk, and he kind of is also embedded in my brain now. Jeff Gothelf did a talk and he spoke about value and understanding definition of done. I'm just going to poke you and say, okay, so just finishing off on this customer satisfaction, the stakeholder satisfaction, trying to shift the definition of done away from it's been tested and it's in prod to the values actually landed up at the users. Because I think that's what the conversation needs to turn towards. It's like we're sending these things, but look at the value we're actually giving the users or the customers of this. And let's look at what those metrics are. Can we start understanding that instead of focusing on, the velocity of our team that's too slow to read, but we're sending value and just shifting that. What's your view on that?
Absolutely. I think that's great. So if velocity is a measure of our productivity, then that productivity is only really valuable if your output is meeting the requirements of the person you're doing it for. So you can, you can generate 1,000 lines of code a day. If it's nonsense, that ticks a effort block, but it's not necessarily useful to someone. So that makes a lot of sense. I worked with a team where, as a simple example, we started taking that transition by going from initially very technical definition of done. So like you said, the things that the team would care about, whether it's if there's documentation to be updated, that's there. There's a certain deploy process that's followed, or deploy pipeline that the process that they follow. And included as I think the very first step was something which is this is going to sound very obvious, but it made a difference by being explicit about that, and that was the product owner has signed off on the story. So anybody listening to this will go, oh, well, but the product owner accepts the work in any case. Yes, but putting that in the definition of done caused someone on the last day to say, or the last day of that story being worked on, to stop and go, can I please get 5 minutes of your time to look at this before I move on to the next thing, which wasn't explicitly happening before. And the product owner was representing the stakeholder and understood what the requirements were. And so it's just another safety net. The safety net was refinement and going into planning and talking to stakeholders before we start, and then recording all the acceptance criteria, and then delivering story by story. This just added another safety net of having someone sit down and look at it at that point, and specifically someone checking, going, are you happy with this when we bring this to review in 5 days' time? So 100%. That's something that should happen anyway, but adding it, put that value check in there as well, and allowed us to not be surprised later that it wasn't quite on par. So that was good.
I like that.
There was a team that I worked with that evolved to start delivering things, delivering quite a lot in their sprint, and so they abandoned the idea of the review at the end and simply had ad hoc reviews. So if halfway through the sprint it was such that stakeholders were available, halfway through the sprint if something was done, they would pull a stakeholder in and say, can we do the review right now instead of at the end of the sprint, and talk about this thing, and that create an opportunity to check that value and to get feedback, so that if there was something, we would still have time to finish that. Let's assume it doesn't change requirements significantly. Finish that within the cadence that we've given ourselves. Instead of if you strictly go with, you should evolve your process. But when you start, you're pulling them into a meeting at the very end called the review, and you get feedback, and that's great. But then you incorporate that in your next iteration.
Exactly.
So I think definitely anything that prioritizes the value validation check is in line with that. So, that makes sense.
What I like about that idea, or the way you've explained it, I've done that, but I haven't formalized it, and I think that's we kind of bring and get those requirement sign-offs, and then because we just want to make sure, but actually making it a thing, like actually saying, guys, this has now become our definition of ready. I really like that. But let's move on to the sorry, go.
So just a quick comment on that. I think that happens for many teams. So what I'm saying is definitely not revolutionary, but like you say, just being cognizant of it and making it explicitly part of what we do, and having a conversation about it reminds us why we're doing that. Which is ultimately the important part.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So let's move to the third component, which is team satisfaction, and this is kind of where your Scrum Master comes in, I suppose. Do you want to elaborate?
Yes. So whether it's a Scrum Master or anybody in the team, the whole team hopefully cares about this part. So the three components, again, as with the first two, kind of play together. So you might have predictability, but it's not keeping your customers happy. So your stakeholders are happy because of slow delivery. You could have a scenario, for argument's sake, in the talk I did many scenarios where you tick one of the two out of the three, and that shows you how they all should work together. here could be a scenario where a team is predictable, so they're delivering at a very predictable rate, and what they say they'll deliver, they're often on target for that. It's at a high rate of delivery, so stakeholders are super happy, they're getting what they want, quality is good. But meanwhile, the team is working 13-hour days, 6 days a week to get there, and they're feeling the pressure and they don't want to let the stakeholders down. The team satisfaction component is where you would pick that up, because they would say, this is not a sustainable way of working, we're not happy with being burnt out. Even though we're proud of what we're doing, it's not a good way to work. So similarly to surveying stakeholders or getting a feedback from them in terms of the deliverable and also interaction with the team, similarly, the suggestion is to survey the team on in whatever way that might be. It might not be a formal survey, it might be discussion, might be some part of it, the tools that they use, might be within the retro, first 5 minutes of retro, you just get a temperature check, whatever the case might be. But two things there as well. One, are we happy with what we delivered? Are we proud of it? Do we think we did well? Do we think our stakeholders are happy? That's an interesting one. Do we think this satisfies our stakeholders? If we think yes and they think no, we probably need to be a little bit closer to them. And then the second component, similar to stakeholders, is did we follow the agreements we put in place for ourselves? Were we true to our definition of ready with the things we took in? Were we true to definition of done with the things we said we've done? Did we follow our working agreements? Are we making work visible? Are we doing all the things that we say we will do to have a consistent, healthy process? And somewhere in there, are we happy? Am I happy with what I'm doing? Do I feel like I'm committing to a fair amount of work? All of those things you pull together. You mentioned Scrum Master, probably a good person to be the custodian of that. And that component is also important. And I would say equally so. So you've got predictability, stakeholder, team, and those three. Instead of having a singular metric, it's sort of a three-pronged metric, which if you track that over time, it tells you some interesting things about how the team might be improving from the stakeholders' eyes, but internally it's causing strain, or stakeholders are happy and the team's happy, but the way they're delivering is unpredictable, and so at some point we're going to run into a problem there because they got lucky that this month and that month they delivered on time, and then in the other month when they did something that was maybe tech debt or something that a stakeholder wasn't too worried about, they weren't predictable. At some point they're going to disappoint a stakeholder, and you can start talking about why that is. So it's useful because it tells you about a team over time, but also because it's somewhat generic. It means you can we don't want to be comparing teams to each other, but you can roll up multiple teams. So if you've got a department with many teams doing diverse things, you could have a view where you take aggregate view on all the predictability, aggregate view on all the client satisfaction, aggregate view on all the team satisfaction, and you can get a metric for that department, which in itself is not valuable, but the trend over time is. So if over time, all three of those are going up, you can make, there will be exceptions and you need to know about them, but you for the team layer.
No, I lost you. Can you hear me?
I lost you. I can hear you. You were static there for a second.
No, I lost you at when you were talking about trends. By measuring the three components, you'll start getting trends over time.
It will be interesting to see if it's on the recording, because obviously that's recorded centrally on the cloud.
It generally doesn't, sadly. Not on my side.
That's what you see. Okay,
yes,
cool.
yes.
So the concept of the trends is that if you have those three components for a team, you're able to say something about that team over time. But also the concept of predictability, customer satisfaction, and team satisfaction are generic enough that you can apply that to different teams regardless of what they're doing. There might be different types of teams doing different kind of work, even following different processes. So a Kanban team, you could look at the cycle time as the thing you look at for predictability. With the Scrum team, you'd look at their velocity, or same concept but stated differently, their commitment versus what they actually deliver over time. And so when you have this three component metric for all these teams, you can say something about each individual team over time. So you're looking for a trend, but you can also aggregate that up. So if you have a large department with a diverse set of teams, you could take the aggregate of all the predictability scores, the aggregate of all the client satisfaction scores, aggregate of all the team satisfaction scores, and create a three-factor metric for the department. And that over time, if you track that, even though it's averaging, it's sort of aggregating and it's telling you a big picture, macro level, there might be exceptions in there. There might be a team somewhere that's struggling, and we have other mechanisms of being aware of that, their own metrics, their Scrum Master, etc. But at the highest level, if that department level metric is going up over time, you can say with a fair amount of confidence that on the whole, things are getting better. We are doing better at the things that are really important. And so that I think is the simplicity of it. I guess you can complicate it if you want to, but it can be quite simple. The simplicity of it gives value, and that you can apply it in that way. And it's really useful as it's not a replacement for all the metrics that you might have that are specific to your domain. So if you're technical, then have technical metrics, but it's a good overall temperature check of whether the process we're following and the practices we're following are giving us the benefits that they should be giving.
I like the fact that you used macro as a word, because macro makes you zoom out. You always think of zooming out when you talk macro. And so it really speaks to that. Yeah. And I think as you were explaining the different components, I couldn't help but think of the concept of for every action, there's a reaction. So if the team is unsatisfied because they had to do a release at 3 o'clock in the morning, over time, there's a reaction to that, and it's going to affect that whole trend that you're talking about. So how do we bring those reactions closer to each other? So, predict everything kind of finds that balance over time, But yeah, that was an amazing conversation, Philip. I would carry on if we could, but I think we've run out of time. But thank you so much. And I think that the biggest lesson that you gave in the talk was just make sure you're measuring something, right?
That's a great place to start. You've got to measure something. So again, I keep saying this, and I say this during the day as well, so that you can have the conversation. It's something that brings your attention to a thing that needs discussing, or that needs consensus, or that needs changing. So if you don't have data, it becomes emotional, and it becomes speculation. So
awesome. I love it.
Cool.